The door to Graceland's music room closed softly behind her. Priscilla Presley stood in the familiar space, surrounded by Elvis's pianos, his guitars, the gold records that lined the walls. It was February, just months after their divorce had been finalized, and Elvis had requested one final meeting, just the two of them. No lawyers, no managers, no Memphis Mafia hovering in the background, just Elvis and the woman he had loved since she was 14 years old. When he walked into the room, Priscilla barely recognized him. The Elvis she remembered was vibrant, electric, full of life. This man moved slowly, his face heavier, his eyes carrying a darkness she had never seen before. He was only 38 years old, but he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. The pills, the exhaustion, the crushing pressure of maintaining the legend, while the man underneath was slowly disappearing. All of it was written across his face in lines that hadn't been there when they married. "Thank you for coming," Elvis said, his voice softer than she remembered. He gestured to the piano bench. "Sit with me." Priscilla sat, keeping a careful distance. The silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid. The failed marriage, the broken promises, the daughter they shared but couldn't raise together. Lisa Marie was only 5 years old, too young to understand why her parents lived in separate worlds, why her father lived in a mansion filled with strangers, while her mother tried to build a normal life in California. Elvis's hands hovered over the piano keys, but he didn't play. Instead, he stared at them like they belonged to someone else. "I never thought it would end like this," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Priscilla felt her throat tighten. She had prepared herself for this meeting, rehearsed what she would say, how she would maintain her composure. But seeing Elvis like this, broken and vulnerable, shattered all her defenses. This wasn't the king of rock and roll sitting across from her. This was the boy from Tupelo, who had once played piano for her in this very room, who had promised her forever, who had looked at her like she was the only person in the world. "Neither did I," she managed to say. Elvis turned to look at her then, and what Priscilla saw in his eyes would haunt her for the rest of her life. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was grief. Pure, unfiltered grief for something that couldn't be fixed. The kind of grief that comes when you realize you've lost something you can never get back, no matter how much you want it, no matter how much you're willing to sacrifice. "Do you remember?" Elvis began, his voice cracking slightly. "Do you remember when I first played Love Me Tender for you, right here, in this room?" Priscilla nodded, unable to speak. Of course she remembered. It was one of the most precious memories of her life. Young Elvis, nervous and sweet, playing that song like it was a prayer. She had been so young, so convinced that their love could overcome anything. The age difference, the fame, the distance, the pressure. She had believed in them with a certainty that only comes once in a lifetime. "I meant every word," Elvis continued, tears welling in his eyes. "Every single word. I loved you more than I knew how to love anyone. And I failed you. I failed us." The raw honesty in his voice broke something inside Priscilla. This wasn't the king of rock and roll confessing. This was just Elvis, a man who had lost everything that mattered, a man who had spent years building an empire while his personal life crumbled around him. A man who could command the adoration of millions but couldn't keep the one person who had loved him before the fame, before the money, before the legend. "Elvis," she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Let me finish," he said. "I need you to know something. I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, not for one day, not even after everything." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was faded, worn at the edges. Priscilla recognized it immediately. It was from their early days together, when she was still a teenager and Elvis was her whole world. They were sitting on the steps at Graceland, young and hopeful, believing their love could conquer anything. She remembered that day. She remembered how Elvis had insisted on taking the photo himself, how he had laughed when she tried to fix her hair, how he had said this moment would mean something to them someday. "I've carried this with me every day," Elvis said, his voice breaking. "Even after you left, even after the divorce, I couldn't let it go." He pressed the photograph into Priscilla's hand, closing her fingers around it. "You keep it," he whispered. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me." And then something happened that Priscilla never expected. Elvis Presley, the man who had performed for millions, who had never shown weakness on stage, began to cry, not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. This wasn't the controlled emotion of a performer. This was the raw, unfiltered pain of a man who had spent years holding everything inside, who had never allowed himself to truly grieve what he was losing. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying between sobs. "I'm so sorry I couldn't be what you needed. I'm so sorry. I lost you. Calm, 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 calm." Priscilla found herself crying too. She reached out and held him, the way she used to when they were young and the world hadn't yet broken them. For a few precious minutes, they were just two people grieving a love that had been real, even if it couldn't last. The Memphis Mafia stood outside the door, unsure whether to intervene. Joe Esposito later said he had never heard Elvis cry like that, not even when his mother died. This was different. This was the sound of a man realizing he had made a mistake he could never fix. When Elvis finally pulled away, he wiped his face with his sleeve, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to fall apart on you," he said, trying to smile. "It's okay," Priscilla whispered. "It's okay to feel." Elvis stood up slowly, like an old man. He walked to the window and looked out at the Graceland grounds, the place that had been both his sanctuary and his prison. The mansion that was supposed to be his home had become a museum of his own life, filled with people who worked for him, who protected him, who enabled him, but who couldn't save him from himself. "Do you ever wonder," he said quietly, "if we could have made it work? If I had been different? If I had been stronger?" Priscilla joined him at the window. "I wonder every day," she admitted. Elvis turned to face her one last time. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice steady now, filled with a terrible finality. "When I'm gone, I want you to know that you were my greatest love, my only real love. Everything else was just noise." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with prophecy. Priscilla wanted to tell him not to talk like that he would live a long life, that they would both move on and find happiness. But the look in his eyes stopped her. Elvis wasn't being dramatic. He was being honest. He knew something was wrong with him, knew that the pills and the pressure and the loneliness were eating him alive. He just didn't know how to stop it. "Don't say that," she whispered instead. "It's the truth," Elvis said simply. He stepped closer, and for one final moment, he held her. Not like a husband holds a wife, but like a man holding on to the last piece of his soul. This wasn't the embrace of two people planning a future together. This was the embrace of two people saying goodbye, knowing they would never have this moment again. When he pulled away, he kissed her forehead gently, the way he used to when they were young. "Goodbye, Priscilla," he said. "Thank you for loving me, even when I didn't deserve it." And then he walked out of the music room, leaving Priscilla standing alone with the photograph and the echo of his words. She would see him again, of course. They had a daughter to raise together. There would be phone calls, occasional visits, civil conversations, at Lisa Marie's school events. But Priscilla knew with a certainty that chilled her that this had been their real goodbye. This was the last time they would be alone together, the last time they would speak without filters, the last time Elvis would allow himself to be vulnerable with her. Elvis Presley died 4 years later, on August 16th, 1977. He was only 42 years old. When Priscilla heard the news, she didn't cry immediately. She sat in silence, holding that worn photograph, remembering the broken man who had confessed his love one final time. She remembered the way his hands had shaken, the way his voice had cracked, the way he had looked at her like she was the only thing that had ever been real in his life. And then she cried. She cried for the boy who had played Love Me Tender on a piano in this very room. She cried for the man who had carried her photograph in his pocket every day. She cried for the love that had been real but not enough to save them. She cried for Lisa Marie, who would grow up without a father. She cried for herself, for the years they had lost, for the promises they had broken. Years later, Priscilla would write in her memoir about that final meeting. She would reveal the words Elvis whispered, the tears he shed, the photograph he gave her. And millions of people would read it and understand that behind the legend, behind the jumpsuits and the screaming crowds, there was just a man who had loved deeply and lost everything. The photograph is still in Priscilla's possession today. She keeps it in a private place, away from cameras and public view. It's not worth much money, just an old faded picture of two young people who believed they would be together forever. But to Priscilla, it's priceless, because it's proof that once, for a little while, she was loved by the king of rock and roll. Not the legend, not the icon, but the man. And he loved her until the very end. If you listen closely to Elvis's recordings from those final years, you can hear it in his voice, the sadness, the longing, the grief. He sang about love and loss with such raw emotion because he was living it every single day. Songs like My Way and How Great Thou Art weren't just performances, they were confessions. They were the words of a man who knew he was running out of time, who knew he had made mistakes he couldn't undo, who knew he had lost the one person who had loved him for who he was, not for what he represented. The tragedy of Elvis Presley isn't just that he died young, it's that he spent his final years knowing he had lost the one person who truly knew him, and there was nothing he could do to get her back. He had choices, opportunities to change, to get help, to step away from the machine that was consuming him, but he couldn't do it. The fame, the money, the expectations, the fear of disappointing millions of people, all of it kept him trapped in a life that was slowly killing him. Priscilla visited Graceland many times after Elvis's death. She would walk through the music room, run her fingers over the piano keys, and remember the man who had broken down in tears, confessing a love that had come too late. She would think about what could have been different, what she could have done differently, what Elvis could have done differently. But the truth is, some things can't be fixed. Some mistakes can't be undone. Some goodbyes are final, no matter how much we wish they weren't. And sometimes, when the light hits the room just right, she can almost hear him playing Love Me Tender, young and hopeful, believing that love was enough to conquer the world. It wasn't. But it was real. And sometimes, that's all we have. The story of Elvis and Priscilla's final goodbye reminds us that even legends are human, that even the king of rock and roll could be brought to his knees by a broken heart. That fame and fortune mean nothing if you lose the person who makes you feel real. In a world that worships celebrity, that treats famous people like they're somehow different from the rest of us, it's important to remember that they feel pain just like we do. They make mistakes just like we do. They lose people they love just like we do. Elvis Presley left this world with many regrets, but those who knew him best say that losing Priscilla was the one he carried heaviest, the one he never made peace with. He had other relationships after Priscilla, but none of them were the same. None of them had the depth, the history, the connection that he had with her. She was the one who knew him before the legend, before the myth, before the world decided who he was supposed to be, and once she was gone, he never found that again. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that he died at 42, but that he spent his final years knowing he had thrown away the best part of his life. And there was no encore, no second chance, no way to go back and do it differently. Just a worn photograph. And a love that lasted beyond the grave. If this story moved you, if it made you think about love and loss and the choices we make, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't about fame and glory. They're about the quiet moments when a man's heart breaks, and all he can do is say goodbye. What do you think Elvis would have done differently? Do you believe second chances are real? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the moments that define legends. Because behind every legend is a human heart, and sometimes that heart breaks in ways no one ever sees.